Taiwan was on the verge of building a nuclear weapon, but the U.S. stepped in, and history was rewritten in secret. In the decades following World War II, Taiwan found itself in a precarious position. The Chinese Civil War had just ended, with the nationalists retreating to Taiwan after the communists took over mainland China. The island was small, isolated, and surrounded by an increasingly hostile neighbor. In the eyes of many in Taiwan's government, conventional military strength alone wasn't enough to guarantee survival. They wanted a deterrent, something that could make the world, and more importantly, Beijing, think twice before considering an attack. That's where the idea of nuclear weapons entered the picture. Taiwan's nuclear ambitions were not a secret to those who were paying attention, but the details were shrouded in secrecy. In the late 1960s and 1970s, the country quietly invested in nuclear research, ostensibly for energy purposes. However, the knowledge and materials for civilian nuclear energy can often be diverted toward weapon development, and Taiwan was no exception. Behind closed doors, top scientists and military officials were exploring the possibility of creating a nuclear bomb, a strategic move they believed was necessary for survival. But Taiwan's dreams did not exist in a vacuum. Across the Pacific, the United States was watching closely. The U.S. had long been a protector of Taiwan, but its priorities were complicated. On one hand, Washington wanted to ensure Taiwan's survival as a democratic ally. On the other hand, the U.S. was deeply committed to nonproliferation. The Cold War was still raging, and the idea of another nuclear-armed state, especially one so close to communist China, was unacceptable. A nuclear Taiwan could easily provoke Beijing into a confrontation, dragging the United States into a war it did not want. In the early 1970s, intelligence began to trickle in. American satellites, spy planes, and diplomatic channels all confirmed what many in Washington had feared. Taiwan was moving closer to producing its own nuclear arsenal. The stakes could not have been higher. A nuclear-armed Taiwan could destabilize the entire region. The U.S. had to act, but the question was how. Military action was out of the question. Taiwan was an ally, and any overt interference could cause a diplomatic crisis. The solution would have to be political, economic, and persuasive. The approach the United States took was methodical. Washington began by leveraging its influence over Taiwan's access to technology and resources. Much of Taiwan's nuclear program relied on imported materials and equipment, often from Western allies. The U.S. quietly made it clear that continued assistance was contingent on strict adherence to nonproliferation agreements. At the same time, American diplomats engaged in persistent dialogue with Taiwanese leaders, emphasizing the risks of going nuclear, not just in terms of international isolation, but also in terms of regional security. There was also a psychological aspect to this campaign. U.S. officials made it known, subtly but unmistakably, that they were fully aware of Taiwan's nuclear ambitions. Behind the closed doors of embassies and high-level meetings, the message was clear. The United States could not allow Taiwan to cross the nuclear threshold. The pressure was relentless, and Taiwan's leaders began to realize that continuing down this path could jeopardize the island's relationship with its most important ally. What makes this story particularly fascinating is how close Taiwan came to achieving its nuclear goals before the U.S. intervention took effect. By the late 1970s, the country had made significant progress in its nuclear program. Facilities had been built, research had advanced, and the technical capability to produce a bomb was within reach. Yet despite this progress, there was no public announcement, no declaration of intent. Everything was conducted under a veil of secrecy, a delicate balancing act that Taiwan hoped would keep its adversaries guessing. The turning point came with a combination of international diplomacy and strategic incentives. The United States offered guarantees of security, and continued support in exchange for Taiwan agreeing to abandon its nuclear ambitions. This was not a simple request. It was a carefully negotiated arrangement. The U.S. provided assurances that Taiwan's defense needs would be met through conventional means, while also reinforcing its commitment to the island's survival. In essence, the message was, "You don't need nuclear weapons because we will protect you." Behind the scenes, there were also elements of subtle coercion. The U.S. made it clear that continued defiance could lead to restrictions on critical technologies, trade embargoes, or diplomatic isolation. For a nation heavily dependent on international trade and foreign aid, the choice became increasingly clear. Taiwan's leaders faced a dilemma: continue pursuing a nuclear program at the risk of international isolation, or relinquish it and secure the backing of their most important ally. Ultimately, pragmatism won. By the early 1980s, Taiwan officially abandoned its nuclear weapons program. Facilities were dismantled or converted to civilian use, and the island committed to the nonproliferation treaty. For Washington, this was a victory, one that ensured regional stability without the need for military confrontation. For Taiwan, it was a difficult but necessary compromise, a recognition that survival sometimes requires restraint. The story of Taiwan's nuclear ambitions is more than just a historical footnote. It is a lesson in the complexities of international politics. It highlights the delicate balance between ambition and pragmatism, secrecy and transparency, and power and diplomacy. Taiwan's leaders believed that nuclear weapons could guarantee security, but the reality was far more nuanced. Security is rarely achieved through weapons alone. It requires alliances, strategic thinking, and the careful management of international relationships. Interestingly, the secrecy surrounding Taiwan's nuclear efforts has fueled decades of speculation. Researchers, journalists, and conspiracy theorists have all tried to piece together the full extent of the program. What is clear, however, is that the U.S. intervention was decisive. Without American pressure, both overt and covert, it is entirely possible that Taiwan could have entered the nuclear club, fundamentally altering the geopolitical landscape of East Asia. This episode also raises larger questions about nuclear proliferation and global security. The world has seen how the possession of nuclear weapons can embolden states, create regional tensions, and trigger arms races. Taiwan's near entry into the nuclear arena serves as a reminder that proliferation is not just a theoretical concern. It is a tangible, ongoing challenge that requires constant vigilance. The United States' approach in this case, combining diplomacy, economic leverage, and security guarantees, offers a blueprint for how such challenges can sometimes be managed without resorting to war. Even today, decades after Taiwan surrendered its nuclear ambitions, the story resonates. The island remains under the shadow of a powerful neighbor, with security concerns as relevant as ever. While Taiwan may not possess nuclear weapons, it has invested in other means of defense and deterrence, from advanced conventional forces to strategic alliances. The legacy of its nuclear program is a reminder that ambition, secrecy, and strategic necessity often collide in ways that shape the course of history. What if things had gone differently? What if Taiwan had managed to develop a nuclear arsenal in secret, without the United States discovering it in time? It's impossible to know for certain, but the consequences could have been profound. Beijing would almost certainly have responded aggressively, potentially sparking a crisis that could have drawn in the U.S. and other global powers. The fragile balance of peace in East Asia could have been shattered, with the world watching as a small island nation held a weapon of unimaginable destructive power. In the end, Taiwan's story is not just about nuclear weapons. It's about the intersection of power, strategy, and survival. It's about how a small nation navigates the pressures of geopolitics, weighing ambition against risk, and making decisions that could shape the fate of millions. It's about the unseen forces of diplomacy and influence, and how they can sometimes achieve what brute force cannot. The surrender of Taiwan's top-secret weapon may never have made headlines around the world, but it changed the course of history nonetheless. It demonstrates that in international relations, knowledge and leverage can be as powerful as bombs and missiles. The U.S. didn't just prevent Taiwan from acquiring a nuclear arsenal. It preserved stability in a critical region, avoided potential conflict, and reinforced the principle that nuclear weapons are not tools to be taken lightly. As we reflect on this story today, we are reminded that behind every headline, every treaty, and every political decision, there are layers of strategy, negotiation, and foresight. The tale of Taiwan's nuclear program is a window into the high-stakes world of global diplomacy, where secrecy, ambition, and careful calculation collide. It is a story that deserves to be remembered, not just for its historical significance, but for the lessons it offers about power, restraint, and the enduring complexity of international relations.